Well, as you know, for about a week we've been talking about a case of the RCMP using a questionnaire to ask questions of migrants just walking across from the U.S. border into Canada, not walking through proper border checkpoints, not making a proper application to become immigrants or even refugees, just sort of marching across the world's longest undefended border. Now, this questionnaire, which we showed briefly on the screen, it looks, I won't say homemade, but it doesn't look like a national standard questionnaire. In fact, the way the Department of Homeland Safety described it, Ralph Goodale's ministry, is that this was created by a local RCMP detachment. Now, most of the questions are pretty bland, as you can see. Number one, where did you come from? Why did you not come to a border crossing? How long have you been in the United States? But it gets interesting about 2/3 of the way through when they start to ask questions about Canadian values. And joining us now to talk about this questionnaire is our friend Giddy Mammon, an immigration and refugee legal expert who joins us now on the road at an airport. So we will be respectful of his time so we don't get you to miss your plane. Giddy, great to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Ezra.
Now, Giddy, this questionnaire had a lot of pretty standard boilerplate questions that anyone who's traveled from Canada to the United States or vice versa has probably been asked at a border checkpoint. I mean, they ask questions all the time. But it gets interesting. I think it's question 40. Giddy, let me just read this to you, and I'd like your reaction to the propriety of this question. It's question 31. Sorry, I got my numbers wrong. Here it is.
That's right.
Canada is a very liberal country that believes in freedom of religious practice and equality between men and women. What is your opinion on this subject? How would you feel if your boss was a woman? And then it asks, how do you feel about women who do not wear the hijab, chador, dupatta, niqab, or burqa? So it's a little bit different than, you know, what's your name, your age, your rank kind of thing. It makes a statement about values and asks people if they are fine with it. Giddy, is this question surprising to you? Does it seem like it's an appropriate question for police to ask border crossers?
Well, that's a big question. First of all, you have to understand the circumstances, Ezra. Right now, the border crossing issue, as you said, is not happening at a regular checkpoint. The officers that have been dispatched to this sort of hole in the fence are not really experienced at vetting refugee claimants. So that's the first thing that you need to allow for. Secondly, the vast majority of those questions I've gone through the questionnaire are very routine, and they're designed to ask questions that we ask of all people who are making asylum claims in Canada. In addition to that, there are certain elements of the questionnaire which deal with the particular circumstances of the case. Why are you leaving the United States? What what was your status there? Did you have any problems there? Those are catered exactly to the circumstances. Then finally, you have question 31, which is the one that I think people are most concerned about and it asks questions about what religion you are, and if you are of the Muslim faith, what do you think of these particular practices? So that's a very big question. First, let me say as follows. If you have to look at the purpose for which the question is being asked, because a question being asked for a racist point of view, for a racist objective, is improper. So, for example, if you're asking people, are you Muslim, are you Jewish, are you whatever, for the purpose of excluding people on the basis of their religion, that would be offensive. There's no question to that. However, in the immigration business, and you'll recall, Ezra, as you know very well, I used to work at the airport back in 1984, and I remember in 1984 when when I was working at Toronto's airport, we were given special training because that year the Pope came to Canada for a visit. And so we were given special training about specific threats to the Pope at that particular time. And they would provide us with a profile of the type of person that we should be looking for who might want to harm the Pope. And of course, we went through all the different political and religious groups that might be interested in potentially harming the Pope. So every person who is in charge of border security, whether you like to admit it or not, is in the business of creating profiles to see if people fit that profile given a particular threat to Canada. So if you believe, for example, that there is a threat to Canada, by virtue of an interpretation of Islam that is dangerous to our way of life, then it is important to ask that question, because that is the concern that we have. Not to do so would not, in my opinion, be to conduct a fulsome and penetrative questioning of people who may be a security threat to the country. Now, some of the questions were a little bit odd, but what they were trying to do is get at the level of religiosity so that they can assess the level of potential risk. Obviously, if the person were to answer the question and the officer were to believe that they had very liberal views, then maybe that would be the end of the interrogation. But if they said, for example, I am or I am not Muslim, the officer can still pursue that line of questioning if he felt that that was relevant to a legitimate threat to Canada. So back to what I was saying, I think you have to look at why the question is being asked before you can determine whether it's improper or not.
Yeah. Well, I think it's clear that these RCMP were not turning back Muslims. First of all, they turned back nobody. And second of all, it's clear that the dominant number of border crossers were Muslim, other than the Haitian example in Montreal. So for someone to say that this was to weed out Muslims is absurd on the face of it. I think you're right. It was to go to what the #1 security threat to Canada is. We just had an ISIS terrorist attack in Edmonton. But I like the point you raised, which is we don't normally have RCMP patrolmen doing border security work. They're not immigration experts, but they've been thrown into that role because we've allowed the immigration system to fall into chaos. So the first thing is, I think you have to give the police a break. That these are cops, they're not immigration officers. And the second point which you raise is, it would be nuts if they didn't ask about a Muslim terrorist threat. But Guinea, the Muslim, as it so happens, immigration minister under Trudeau, Ahmed Hassan, has said that this questionnaire will be banned. Now, do you think there's going to be maybe a more slightly better, more artfully worded version of this? Or do you think police will just be told you can't ask any more questions about Islam and radicalism?
First of all, this is not an issue of the immigration minister. Border security is the responsibility of the Minister of Public Safety, Ralph Goodale. I'm not sure why the immigration minister is weighing in on this issue, because it's a border security issue. Secondly, I would say that you're kidding yourself if you think that this question in some form or another is not going to be dealt with throughout the refugee process. I've done refugee claims over many, many years, and as you know, one of the refugee claim bases for convention refugee status is religion. And I have attended many hearings where they ask very probing questions about the religion that you claim to be. If you were claiming, for example, that you were being persecuted in Russia because you're Jewish, they would ask you questions about your faith to see if you are in fact Jewish and if the public would perceive you as being Jewish. If you said you were an Ahmadi, they would ask you questions about your Ahmadi faith to see if you were really an Ahmadi, a member of that community, because that is the community that was specifically being targeted. And I have attended quite a number of CSIS interviews where even after the refugee has been accepted, maybe that person comes from a part of the world where there is a high incidence of terrorism, for example, or a group that is acting outside of international law. And you can bet that a CSIS officer in the presence of the client's counsel is going to be asking probing questions, far more probing than those that I saw in that questionnaire. Now, what I think this is a public relations failure, but in terms of a security failure, it is not a security failure. As I said, when I was working at the airport, we profiled people all the time. We took into account their race, their religion. We took into account the season that they were traveling in, the time of year, what the destination was, what the duration of their absence from Canada was, or their plan to visit Canada. And we took all of those things to see if that person fits a profile that we are concerned about. So, for example, we were concerned when we had young women going to the Caribbean for a couple of days and returning, especially when it was off season. We would suspect that that person might be a drug courier. There's all kinds of profiles that you could conjure up which constitute legitimate concerns for the country. Of course, if the purpose of the question is to affect a racist outcome, I don't like blacks, therefore I'm going to exclude you. I don't like Jews, I don't like Muslims, I'm going to ask you those questions so that I can exclude you. That's a real problem. But as you mentioned, no one was excluded, and those questions may very well go to the heart of the refugee claim, which is what the CBSA is supposed to do at a proper screening of refugee claimants appearing at our border.
Yeah. Well, Giddy, this is very illuminating. I didn't know you worked at an airport, and that's a fascinating detail of the kind of I mean, obviously, if you were screening young women going to the Caribbean for a few days, you weren't anti-women. You were just looking for the profile for a drug mule. You weren't anti-women, and that's the same thing here. I don't have any information that a single migrant over the last year has been turned back from Canada's borders at these non-official crossings. I understand that 50 of them have had their immigration cases refused, but that's not the same thing as being deported. I would be skeptical if as much as 1% of these cross-border walkers have been turned back. I don't even think it's 1%. So this questionnaire, I wish it was more toothy. I think it's just police trying to put their finger in the dike, which is, crumbling. I think that the dam is about to burst. Last word to you, Giddy. Do you think we're actually going to stop a terrorist from coming in, or do you think the total chaos of the system means we really have no border at all?
It's a crapshoot, Ezra. Every single time you allow in a person into the country, from any country, you have a potential security threat. I don't believe that the RCMP were asking these questions in order to be racist. They were just simply following the information they were asked to elicit. I don't think the drafter, the author of this questionnaire, was trying to be racist. I think what they were trying to do is extract information from a person as to their possible fundamentalism in terms of the Muslim faith, and to determine if that constitutes a security threat. I think they have a job to do. It's not easy, and you can be certain that because they ask a question doesn't mean that that question is going to be answered honestly. Yeah. And even with that answer, even if the officer believes it, that doesn't mean that the answer is true. Yeah. And even if a person enters into Canada with perfectly innocent intentions, it doesn't mean that the next day they don't fall into a community or into a circle which radicalizes them or changes their political opinions, because that's what Canada's about. Canada's about freedom and the exchange of political opinions and the expression of ideas. And so they can come in perfectly innocent, maybe as a young child, as a person who wants to get away from the war, the terror. They come to Canada, and for some reason they embrace that philosophy. It's a very difficult job that we're asking our security people to do, and they are going to have some successes, and sadly they will have some failures. Yeah.
Wow, Giddy, I learn so much from you every time we talk. I'm always so grateful for your time, especially today. I know you're literally in transit yourself at an airport. I thought it was a pretty good Skype interview, considering we caught you in the middle of an airport terminal. Always grateful to you. Thank you for your wisdom and your deep experience. I learned a little bit about you today, that you were helping guard our country from would-be assassins in 1984. I'm glad you did your job. Thanks, my friend.
Thank you, my friend.
All right. That's Giddy Mammon, our favorite immigration and refugee lawyer, a man who cares deeply for immigrants and refugees. You heard the man himself. He has attended many refugee application hearings, but he also deeply cares about protecting Canada from those who wish it harm. He's one of my favorite guests, and you can see why. Hey, if you like that, sign up for my show every day. Click on the screen to subscribe.